I hadn't planned on coming back. 3 years in Portland had given me enough distance from this place to forget the way the morning light cuts through the oak trees on Maple Street or how the air here tastes different, cleaner somehow, like it's been filtered through wheat fields and Sunday prayers. But Mom's voice on the phone carried that particular weight that meant this wasn't really a request. And Dad's hip surgery had left them scrambling to fulfill their promise to the church board. "It's just painting, Danny," she'd said, as if the simplicity of the task could somehow minimize the months I'd be spending back in the town I'd worked so hard to leave. "Father Mackenzie says it shouldn't take more than the summer if there are 2 people working on it." 2 people. That detail should have mattered more to me then. I drove in on a Tuesday evening in late May, my Honda loaded with the few belongings I'd need for a summer in my childhood bedroom. The town looked smaller than I remembered, the way places do when you've grown used to city blocks and coffee shops on every corner. Main Street still had the same 3 restaurants, the same hardware store where Mr. Peterson had sold me my first fishing rod when I was 12. The church sat at the end of Elm Street like it always had, its white wooden steeple catching the last rays of daylight. St. Catherine's had been built in 18, and it looked every year of its age. The paint was peeling in long strips along the south wall, and the foundation showed patches of bare wood weathered gray as old bones. It would be honest work, the kind that left you tired in a good way. I could handle a summer of honest work. Wednesday morning came with the kind of golden light that makes you believe in something larger than yourself, even if you're not sure what that something might be. I arrived at 7:30 with my father's paint clothes and a thermos of coffee Mom had pressed into my hands, along with 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and a reminder to call if I needed anything. The church parking lot was empty except for a dark blue pickup truck I didn't recognize, toolbox visible in the bed, ladder secured with bungee cords. Someone else was already here. I found him around the back of the building, crouched beside 2 5-gallon buckets of primer, studying the church wall like he was reading something written in its weathered grain. He looked up when he heard my footsteps on the gravel, and I got my first real look at Matthew Reeves. I knew the name, of course. Reeves Construction had done work for half the families in town, and Matthew had been part of that crew since high school. But knowing someone's name and actually seeing them are different things entirely. He was older than me by maybe 5 years, with the kind of tan that comes from years of outdoor work, not weekend trips to the lake. His dark hair was already damp with sweat despite the early hour, pushed back from his forehead in a way that suggested he'd run his fingers through it while thinking. "You must be Danny," he said, straightening up. His voice was quiet, roughened by morning and cigarettes. "I'm Matthew." I nodded, suddenly aware of how my own voice might sound after the drive, after 3 years of city life that had softened more than just my accent. "Yeah, thanks for... I'm glad there's 2 of us." Something that might have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Your dad said you had experience. Summers in high school, nothing like this, though." I gestured at the church, its bulk seeming more imposing now that I was standing next to it with paintbrush in hand. "We'll start with primer," Matthew said, turning back to the buckets. "Get the worst of the weathering sealed up before we put the finish coat on." He handed me a brush, his fingers rough with calluses. "You take the east wall, I'll take the south. We'll work our way around." That was it. No extended conversation about technique or timeline. No small talk about my years away or his years here. Just the work, laid out simple and clear. I found myself grateful for that simplicity. We worked in silence for the first hour, the sound of our brushes against wood creating a rhythm that needed no discussion. I could hear him on the other side of the building, steady and methodical, while I worked my way along the foundation, painting over patches of bare wood that had been baking in the summer sun for who knew how long. The primer went on thick and white, covering years of weathering with each stroke. There was something satisfying about it, the way the church began to look renewed even before we'd started on the actual paint. I fell into the rhythm of it, brush loaded, 3 strokes across, brush loaded again, working my way up toward the windows that looked out over the cemetery. When I came around the corner to refill my brush, Matthew was balanced on a ladder about 10 feet away, working on the higher sections of the south wall. His t-shirt was already sticking to his back with sweat, and there were flecks of white primer in his dark hair. He didn't look over when I approached the paint bucket, but something in the way he moved his brush changed slightly, became more deliberate. "How's it looking over there?" he asked without turning around. "Good. The wood's in better shape than I expected." I dipped my brush, careful not to take too much primer. Some of these boards probably haven't been painted in 20 years. Longer than that. My dad worked on this church back in '98, said then it was overdue. I glanced up at him, surprised by the personal detail. He was looking down at me now, one hand braced against the ladder, the other still holding his brush. His eyes were brown, darker than I'd noticed before, and there was paint on his forearm where he'd brushed against something. Your dad's been doing this a long time? 35 years. I've been working with him since I was 16. He turned back to the wall. Learned most of what I know right here, actually. Church jobs, you can't cut corners, too many people watching. I laughed, a short sound that carried more truth than humor. I remember, Mrs. Patterson used to inspect my lawn mowing like she was grading a test. Still does, Matthew said, and I caught that almost smile again. She brought me lemonade last week and mentioned 3 times that the trim around her windows needed touching up. Some things never change. No, he agreed, his voice softer now. They don't. We worked through the morning, the sun climbing higher and the air growing thick with humidity. By 10 o'clock, both of us had stripped down to t-shirts, and by 11, even those were becoming uncomfortable. Matthew had rolled his sleeves up past his elbows, exposing forearms corded with muscle and scattered with old scars, the kind you get from years of working with your hands. I tried not to notice, tried to keep my attention on the section of wall in front of me, on the way the primer covered the weathered wood, on anything except the sound of Matthew's breathing when he stretched to reach a high spot, or the way his jeans sat on his hips when he bent to refill his brush. This was exactly the kind of thing I'd left town to avoid. The careful dance of not looking, not noticing, not letting my eyes linger on details that didn't concern me. Portland had been different. Portland had coffee shops where men held hands and no one stared, bookstores with rainbow flags in the windows, entire neighborhoods where being yourself wasn't a political statement. Here, even thinking too long about the curve of someone's back felt dangerous. But Matthew Reeves had very good hands, and when he pushed his hair back from his forehead, leaving a streak of white primer along his temple, I found myself watching longer than I should have. Around noon, the heat became impossible to ignore. The sun beat down on the church parking lot like a physical weight, and the primer was starting to get tacky in the bucket before I could get it on the wall. Matthew appeared around the corner, his t-shirt dark with sweat, hair plastered to his head. "We should take a break," he said, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Come back when it cools off some." I nodded, grateful for the reprieve. The heat was making me dizzy, or maybe it was something else entirely. "What time?" 4 or maybe 5. Sun will be on the other side by then. He was already walking toward his truck, gathering up brushes and covering the paint buckets. "You need a ride anywhere?" "No, I'm good. My parents' place is just a few blocks." He nodded, loading his ladder into the truck bed with the easy efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times. "See you this evening, then." I watched him drive away, dust rising from his tires as he turned onto Elm Street. Only when the sound of his engine had faded completely did I realize I'd been standing there longer than necessary, paint-stained and sweating in the church parking lot. Watching the space where his truck had been, the afternoon stretched long and humid. I tried to nap in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by baseball trophies and college textbooks I'd never bothered to pack. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling fan, thinking about the way Matthew had looked balanced on that ladder, the careful precision of his brushwork, the quiet authority in his voice when he'd suggested we take a break. I thought about other things too. The way he'd said my name that morning, like he'd been practicing it. The almost smile that seemed to suggest he found something amusing about the world, or about me specifically. The fact that in 3 hours of working in close proximity, he'd never once made me feel like I was being measured against some standard I couldn't meet. By 4:30, I was back at the church, eager for something to do with my hands other than worry the edge of my bedsheet. Matthew's truck was already there, and I could hear the soft whisper of his brush against wood as I gathered my supplies. He'd moved to the west wall, working in the shade now, and when I came around the corner, he looked up from his work with something that might have been relief. "Thought you might not come back," he said. "It's not that hot." "It's 93 degrees, Danny." The way he said my name made something settle in my chest, warm and unfamiliar. "I've worked in worse." "In Portland?" I paused, surprised he'd remembered that detail. "No, here actually, summers during high school." "Right, I think I remember seeing you around then. You worked for Patterson's landscaping company." He remembered me. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. I'd spent those summers carefully invisible, head down, focused on the work and nothing else. But Matthew Reeves had noticed me, enough to remember years later. For 2 summers, I said, focusing on loading my brush with primer, before I figured out I was better with books than plants. What do you do now, in Portland? Library work, research mostly. It sounded boring even to me, the kind of safe, indoor job that kept me away from complications like this one. What about you? Still working with your dad? Some. I do a lot of residential stuff on my own now. Kitchens, bathrooms, that kind of thing. He dipped his brush, wiped the excess against the bucket rim. It pays better than church work. But you're here anyway. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that I wondered if I'd overstepped somehow. Then he said, my mom goes here. She's been asking the church board to get this place painted for 5 years. When they finally got the money together, he shrugged. Seemed like something I should do. There was more to it than that, I could tell. Something in the way he'd paused, the careful neutrality of his tone. But I didn't push. We'd barely known each other for 6 hours. I had no right to his deeper motivations. We worked until sunset, the heat finally breaking as the sun dropped behind the oak trees that lined the cemetery. The primer was going on easier now, flowing smooth and white across the weathered boards. I'd found my rhythm again, the meditative quality of repetitive work that had always calmed my mind. Matthew finished his section first and came around to where I was working, cleaning his brush in the small jar of thinner he kept clipped to his belt. You're good at this, he said, watching me work, but it's just primer. No, I mean it. You've got steady hands, good coverage. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell sawdust, sweat, and something else. Something that might have been soap or aftershave. A lot of people rush it. I tried to focus on the wall in front of me, on the section of weathered wood that still needed covering, but my awareness had narrowed to the space between us. 2 feet, maybe less. Close enough to hear the way his breathing had deepened slightly, close enough to see the paint-flecked watch on his wrist. My dad always said to take your time with the prep work, I managed. Smart man. Matthew was still watching me work, and I could feel the weight of his attention like heat on my skin. The finish coat's only as good as what's underneath. Something in his tone made me look up, and for a moment, we stood there in the growing dusk, paintbrushes in our hands, looking at each other with an intensity that had nothing to do with home improvement. His eyes were darker in the evening light, and there was primer on his cheek that I wanted to wipe away with my thumb. Then he stepped back, breaking whatever spell had been building between us. We should clean up, getting too dark to see what we're doing. I nodded, not trusting my voice. We worked together to cover the paint buckets, clean the brushes, gather the tools scattered around the church foundation. The easy rhythm we'd found during the day had shifted into something more careful, more aware. When he handed me a rag to wipe the primer from my hands, our fingers brushed, and I felt that contact all the way up my arm. Same time tomorrow? He asked as we loaded the last of the equipment into his truck. Yeah, same time. He nodded, climbed into the cab, then rolled down the window. Danny? Yeah? Thanks for today. It's good to have help. Thanks for showing me what to do. He smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes and changed the entire shape of his face. See you tomorrow. I watched his taillights disappear down Elm Street, then walked the 6 blocks to my parents' house in the gathering darkness. The air was finally cooling, carrying the scent of honeysuckle and freshly cut grass. Porch lights were coming on up and down the street, yellow squares of warmth in windows where families were settling in for the evening. Mom had left a plate covered with foil on the kitchen counter, pot roast and mashed potatoes, green beans from her garden. I ate standing at the sink, looking out at the backyard where Dad's tomatoes were already heavy on the vine. This place hadn't changed, not in any way that mattered, but something in me was shifting. Some carefully maintained distance was beginning to crack. I went to bed early, but sleep came slow and restless. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Matthew balanced on that ladder, the careful way he moved his brush across the weathered wood, the moment when he'd stood too close and looked at me like he was trying to figure something out. I told myself it was nothing. A moment of connection between 2 people doing hard work in the heat. The kind of thing that felt significant in the moment but would fade by morning. But when I finally slept, I dreamed of steady hands and primer-flecked hair, and the way someone had said my name like it was worth remembering. Thursday brought clouds and a blessed drop in temperature. I arrived at the church to find Matthew already there, standing beside his truck with 2 cups of coffee and a paper bag that smelled like fresh donuts. Thought you might be hungry, he said, handing me one of the cups. Betty's Bakery. She remembered you, by the way. Betty remembers everyone. I accepted the coffee gratefully, surprised by the gesture. It was still hot, and someone had added cream and sugar without asking how I liked it. It was perfect. How did she remember how I take my coffee? Said you used to come in before school, senior year mostly. Matthew pulled 2 glazed donuts from the bag, handed me one. She's got a good memory for details. Senior year. I remembered those mornings now, stopping at Betty's before first period to buy coffee and a donut with money I'd earned mowing lawns. I'd been 17, maybe 18, careful and quiet, and desperate to get through graduation so I could leave for college. The idea that Betty had been paying attention to my coffee preferences, that she'd remembered them a decade later, felt both touching and slightly unsettling. Small towns, I said. Yeah. Matthew leaned back against his truck, studying me over the rim of his coffee cup. You miss it, the small town thing? Sometimes. It was more honest than I'd intended to be. Portland's great, but you can go weeks without seeing the same person twice. Here, everyone knows your business, but they also know when you need help. Like church painting. Like church painting. We finished our coffee in comfortable silence, sharing the donuts and watching the morning light filter through the oak trees. There were birds in the branches overhead, cardinals and blue jays calling to each other in the language of territory and season. It was peaceful in a way I'd forgotten was possible, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling with conversation. Ready to get started? Matthew asked finally, crushing his empty cup and tossing it into the truck bed. Ready. We'd finished the primer coat on the east and south walls the day before, so we moved to the north side where the wood was in worse condition. Some of the boards were split along the grain, and there were places where the paint had peeled away in sheets, leaving raw wood exposed to years of weather. Matthew set up his ladder while I laid out the brushes and opened a fresh bucket of primer. We'd fallen into an easy division of labor. He took the high work that required ladder placement and balance. I took everything I could reach from the ground. It was efficient and safe, and it kept us working close enough to maintain a conversation when we wanted one. This section's going to need more work, Matthew said, running his hand along a board about 8 feet up. Some of these are going to have to be replaced before we can paint them. Is that something we can do? I can. Got the tools and the lumber. Question is whether the church board wants to pay for it. I looked up at him, balanced on the ladder with one hand braced against the church wall. Would you do it anyway? If they couldn't afford it? He was quiet for a moment, considering. Probably. My mom would never forgive me if I let the church fall apart over a few boards. She must be proud of you. She worries more than she's proud. Thinks I should be married with kids by now, contributing to the next generation of St. Catherine's parishioners. There was something in his voice, a careful neutrality that suggested we were approaching deeper water. Is that what you want? Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear it. I don't know what I want anymore. Used to think I did. I wanted to ask what had changed, what had made him uncertain about things that had once seemed clear. But we were still too new to each other, still learning the boundaries of what could be said and what should remain private. So I kept painting, working primer into the grain of weathered wood, and let his words settle between us like dust in still air. We worked steadily through the morning, the threat of rain keeping the temperature down but adding humidity that made everything stick to everything else. My t-shirt was clinging to my back and primer was accumulating on my hands despite my best efforts to stay clean. Matthew wasn't faring any better. His hair was damp with sweat, and there were paint streaks on his arms where he'd wiped his hands. Around 11, he climbed down from the ladder and stood beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat coming off his skin. We're making good progress, he said, surveying the wall we'd been working on. Better than I expected. This primer covers well. Yeah, it's good stuff. Expensive, but worth it. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of primer along his temple. You've got some paint in your hair. Where? I reached up automatically, trying to find it. Here. He stepped closer, lifting his hand toward the side of my head. Hold still. His fingers brushed against my hair, gentle and careful, working out a spot of primer that had somehow gotten tangled near my ear. He was close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, close enough to count the freckles across his nose. His touch was light, almost tentative, but it seemed to last longer than necessary. Got it, he said finally, but he didn't step back immediately. Instead, he stood there with his hand still raised near my face, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. The moment stretched between us, weighted with possibility and fear in equal measure. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, could feel the warmth of his body in the space between us. If I leaned forward just a little, if I closed that gap. Thunder rumbled overhead, low and distant but unmistakable. Matthew stepped back quickly as if the sound had broken whatever spell had been building between us. "We should probably pack up," he said, his voice careful and neutral again. "That storm's moving in faster than I thought." I looked up at the sky, noting the way the clouds had darkened while we'd been working. "Good call. This primer won't dry right if it gets rained on." We worked quickly to cover the paint buckets and gather the brushes. The first drops of rain began to fall as Matthew was securing the ladder in his truck bed. Fat drops that splattered on the hot pavement and sent up the smell of summer rain. "You want a ride?" he asked, jogging back from his truck. "It's going to pour in about 2 minutes. I can walk, it's not that far. Danny." The way he said my name stopped me mid-step. "It's going to pour." As if summoned by his words, the sky opened up. Rain came down in sheets, soaking us both in seconds. Matthew grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the church, fumbling with the keys Father Mackenzie had given us for emergencies. The front door swung open and we stumbled inside, dripping and breathless. The church was dim and cool, filled with the scent of old wood and candle wax. Rain drummed against the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the empty pews. "Jesus," Matthew said, pushing his wet hair back from his forehead. "That came out of nowhere." I looked down at myself, taking inventory. My t-shirt was plastered to my chest, my jeans were dark with water, and my shoes squelched when I moved. Matthew was in similar condition, his shirt clinging to the muscles of his back and shoulders, water dripping from his hair onto the worn carpet of the vestibule. "So much for staying dry," I said. "Yeah, well, could be worse." He wrung water from the hem of his shirt, and I tried not to watch the way the movement pulled the fabric tight across his chest. At least we got the paint covered. We stood there for a moment, listening to the rain against the windows, both of us dripping on the church carpet and trying not to acknowledge the way our wet clothes had made us suddenly, intensely aware of each other's bodies. The air between us felt charged, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. "I should call my parents," I said finally. Let them know where I am." "Good idea." Matthew walked deeper into the church, toward the front where the altar stood surrounded by flowers. "I'm going to check the windows, make sure none of them are leaking." I pulled out my phone and called home, explaining to my mother that I was waiting out the storm in the church and would be home when it passed. She fussed appropriately about me getting soaked, reminded me to change clothes as soon as I got home, and promised to have hot soup ready when I arrived. When I hung up, I found Matthew standing in front of the altar, looking up at the stained glass window that dominated the front wall of the church. It depicted Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, surrounded by sleeping disciples, his face turned upward in prayer or anguish. "I used to stare at that window during services," he said without turning around, trying to figure out what he was thinking. "And did you figure it out?" "No." He turned to face me, and there was something vulnerable in his expression, something that suggested we were moving into territory that had nothing to do with church windows or childhood memories, still trying to figure out a lot of things. The rain continued to fall, steady and relentless, trapping us in this space that felt removed from the rest of the world. We were alone in a way we hadn't been before, surrounded by the quiet sanctity of the church and the intimate atmosphere created by our wet clothes and shared shelter. "Like what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I was ready for the answer. Matthew looked at me for a long moment, his brown eyes serious and searching. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, like why I volunteered to paint this church when I could have been working on jobs that actually pay money. "You said your mom wanted it done. That's part of it." He took a step closer, and I could see water still clinging to his hair, could smell the rain on his skin. "But there's more to it than that." "What's the more?" Another step, and now we were close enough that I could see the rise and fall of his chest, could hear the slight catch in his breathing. "I heard you were coming back to help with the painting." The words hung between us like a confession. heavy with implication. I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of some restraint I'd been holding onto since I'd first seen him crouched beside those paint buckets. Matthew! I know. His voice was rough now, thick with something that might have been regret or desire or both. I know it's complicated. I know you're leaving again at the end of the summer. I know this is a small town and people talk and neither of us needs that kind of attention. Then why? Because I've been thinking about you for 3 years, Danny. Ever since I heard you'd moved to Portland. Ever since I realized I'd missed my chance to say something when we were both younger and stupider and maybe brave enough to figure it out together. The confession hit me like a physical force, knocking the breath from my lungs. 3 years. He'd been thinking about me for 3 years, while I'd been in Portland trying to forget that places like this existed, trying to build a life that didn't require me to hide who I was or pretend I didn't notice when men looked at me the way Matthew was looking at me now. I didn't know, I said, because it was the truth and because I didn't know what else to say. How could you? I was too scared to say anything back then. Too worried about what people would think, what it would mean. He ran a hand through his wet hair, a gesture that seemed both nervous and resigned. But when I heard you were coming back, I thought maybe this was my chance to find out if you'd been thinking about me too. I have. The words came out before I could stop them, honest and raw and terrifying. God, Matthew, I have. Something in his face changed, relief and hope and something deeper flooding his features. He took another step forward, close enough now that if I reached out, I could touch him, close enough that I could see the water drops caught in his eyelashes, could count the freckles scattered across his cheekbones. What do we do with that? He asked, his voice so quiet I could barely hear it over the rain. I didn't have an answer. We stood there in the dim light of the church, soaked and trembling and balanced on the edge of something that could change everything, or destroy everything, depending on how we chose to fall. Thunder rolled overhead again, closer this time, and the lights in the church flickered. The moment stretched between us, fragile and precious and impossible to sustain. The rain's letting up, I said finally, though it wasn't true. Matthew nodded, though he didn't look toward the windows. Yeah, we should probably head home. Get out of these wet clothes. Yeah. But neither of us moved. We stood there in the charged air of the church vestibule, looking at each other, with the weight of confession between us, neither ready to break the spell that the storm had created. Finally, Matthew stepped back, putting distance between us that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. I'll drive you home. You don't have to. Danny. There was my name again, spoken like a prayer or a promise. Let me drive you home. The ride to my parents' house was quiet except for the sound of the rain on the truck's roof and the steady swish of windshield wipers. Matthew kept his eyes on the road, his hands careful on the steering wheel, but I could feel the tension radiating from him like heat. Every few seconds, his gaze would flick toward me, then back to the road, as if he was trying to memorize something he might not see again. When we pulled into my parents' driveway, he put the truck in park, but didn't turn off the engine. Tomorrow? He asked. If it's not raining. If it's not raining. I opened the door and stepped out into the drizzle, then turned back to look at him through the open window. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between hope and resignation. Matthew? Yeah? Thanks for the coffee and the donut. A smile touched the corner of his mouth, small but genuine. You're welcome. I stood in the driveway and watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing into the gray afternoon. Only when I couldn't hear his engine anymore did I turn and walk toward the house, my wet shoes squelching on the front steps. Mom was waiting with towels and hot soup and a dozen questions about whether I was catching cold. I answered them as best I could while trying not to think about the way Matthew had looked at me in the church, the weight of his confession, the way my name sounded when he said it like it mattered. That evening, I lay in my childhood bed listening to the rain against my window and thinking about the summer ahead. 2 more months of working beside Matthew Reeves, of careful conversations and meaningful glances and the growing weight of things we'd said and things we hadn't said yet. 2 more months of pretending I didn't notice the way he moved, the way he said my name, the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. 2 more months of trying not to fall in love with someone I'd have to leave behind when the summer ended. But as I finally drifted off to sleep, I realized I might already be too late for that kind of caution. Part 2. The summer settled into a rhythm that felt both sustainable and impossible. July passed in a haze of heat and careful conversation, of paint-stained fingers and glances that lasted just a beat too long. We'd moved past the primer now, working our way around the church with the finish coat, a warm white that caught the morning light and made the old building look renewed, purposeful, like something worth preserving. The work was going well. Better than well, if I was being honest. Matthew's estimate of the summer had been conservative. At the rate we were progressing, we'd be finished by mid-August, maybe sooner. The thought should have been satisfying. A job well done, a promise kept to my parents and the church board. Instead, it sat in my chest like a stone, heavy with the knowledge that every day brought us closer to the end of whatever this was. Matthew brought coffee every morning, always prepared exactly the way I liked it. I'd started bringing lunch for both of us. Sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, fruit from my mother's garden, sometimes cookies she'd pressed on me with instructions to share. We'd sit in the shade of the oak trees during the brutal midday heat, eating in comfortable silence, or talking about safe things. The weather, the work, stories from our shared past that felt distant enough to be harmless. But the careful boundaries we'd established were shifting, slowly and inevitably, like a foundation settling under weight. There were moments when the space between us felt charged with possibility, when a glance or a gesture would carry more meaning than any words we'd spoken. Like the afternoon in early July, when I was working on the window trim around the east wall, balanced on the middle rung of a ladder, concentrating on getting clean lines around the old glass. The work was detailed, requiring steady hands and patience, and I'd been at it for nearly an hour when Matthew appeared beside the ladder. "Need a hand?" he asked, and something in his voice made me look down. He was standing close to the base of the ladder, close enough that I could see the sweat gathered at his hairline, the way his t-shirt clung to his chest. There were flecks of paint on his forearms where he'd brushed against something, and his hands, God, his hands, were wrapped around the ladder rails, steadying it without being asked. "I'm okay," I said, though my voice came out rougher than I'd intended. "You sure? You've been up there a while." I looked down at him again, and this time our eyes met directly. The afternoon light was slanting through the oak trees, casting shadows that moved with the breeze. And in that shifting light, Matthew looked younger somehow, more vulnerable, like the boy I might have known in high school if I'd been brave enough to look, brave enough to see. "I'm sure," I said, but I didn't look away. Neither did he. We stayed like that for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Him looking up at me with something that might have been concern or might have been something else entirely. Me looking down at him and trying not to think about how easy it would be to climb down, to close the distance between us, to find out what would happen if I stopped being careful. "Okay," he said finally, but his hands stayed on the ladder rails. "I'll be right here if you need anything." The promise in those words, "I'll be right here," settled into my chest like warmth, like safety, like something I didn't know I'd been missing until he offered it. I went back to painting the window trim, but my awareness had narrowed to the sound of his breathing below me, the warmth of his presence, the knowledge that his hands were there, steady and sure, making sure I didn't fall. When I finally climbed down 20 minutes later, he was still there, still watching. Our eyes met again as my feet touched the ground. And for a moment, we stood close enough that I could smell sawdust and sweat and something that was just him, just Matthew. "Good work," he said, his voice quiet. "Thanks for spotting me." "Anytime." The word hung between us, loaded with more meaning than a simple offer of help. Anytime. As if there would be more summers, more churches to paint, more reasons to stand this close and pretend we were only talking about ladders and window trim. Or the morning in late July when the heat was already brutal by 8 a.m. The kind of oppressive humidity that made the air itself feel thick and difficult to breathe. We'd both stripped down to just our jeans and work boots, shirts discarded in favor of survival, and even then the sweat was constant, streaming down our backs and making the paintbrushes slippery in our hands. Matthew was working on the high trim along the roofline, balanced on his ladder with the kind of easy confidence that came from years of this work. I was supposed to be focusing on the section of wall at ground level, but my attention kept drifting upward, drawn by the fluid way he moved, the careful precision of his brushwork, the play of muscles across his back as he stretched to reach a difficult spot. He was beautiful in the morning light, beautiful in the way that working men sometimes are, when they're lost in the rhythm of their craft. There was paint in his dark hair and sweat gathered in the hollow between his shoulder blades, and when he reached for the paint bucket, the movement pulled his jeans tight across his hips in a way that made my mouth go dry. I forced myself to look away, to focus on my own section of wall, but the damage was done. My awareness of him had sharpened to something almost painful, a constant pull that made it hard to concentrate on anything else. When I looked up again, I found him watching me with the same focused attention I'd been paying to him. Our eyes met across the space between us, and something electric passed between us. A recognition that we were both fighting the same battle and losing it in slow, careful increments. "Water break?" he asked, his voice slightly hoarse. "Yeah, water break." We'd taken to keeping a cooler in the shade behind the church, filled with ice and bottles of water that stayed cold even in the brutal afternoon heat. Matthew handed me a bottle, his fingers brushing mine in a contact that felt both accidental and entirely deliberate. "This heat's going to kill us," he said, twisting the cap off his own bottle. "We could start earlier, 6 instead of 7. "Good idea." He tilted his head back to drink, and I watched the movement of his throat, the way water ran down his chin to drip onto his chest. Or we could take longer breaks. We could do that too, but we both knew we wouldn't. The work was a reason to be here, to be together, and stretching it out felt like the only way to postpone whatever came next. The end of the job, the end of the summer, the end of whatever this careful dance was that we'd been performing around each other for weeks. We stood in the shade drinking water and not talking about any of it, the weight of unsaid things settling between us like dust in still air. By the first week of August, we were down to detail work, touch-ups around the windows, careful attention to the trim that framed the front doors, second coats where the wood had been particularly weathered, the kind of work that required patience and precision that couldn't be rushed no matter how much we might want to. The church looked transformed. What had been weathered and tired in June now stood clean and bright in the summer sun, its white walls reflecting light in a way that made the whole building seem to glow. People had started to notice, slowing their cars as they drove past, stopping to comment when they saw us working. "Looks real good," Mrs. Patterson had said the morning before, standing in the parking lot with her hands on her hips and approval in her voice. "Real professional job." Matthew had thanked her with the kind of quiet politeness he reserved for the church ladies, but I'd seen the way his shoulders had straightened, the small smile that had touched the corner of his mouth. He was proud of the work we'd done, and he had every right to be. It was good work, careful work, the kind of job that would last for years. But pride was complicated by the knowledge that finishing meant ending, and ending meant I'd have to make decisions I wasn't ready to make. In 3 weeks, maybe less, the job would be done. I'd pack my car and drive back to Portland, back to my quiet apartment and my library job and my careful, controlled life. Back to a place where I could be myself without worrying about who might be watching, but also back to a place where no one brought me coffee in the morning or knew how I liked my sandwiches or said my name like it mattered. The thought sat in my chest like a weight, getting heavier with each passing day. It was a Thursday afternoon in early August when everything shifted again. We were working on the final coat around the front entrance, me on the ladder working on the upper trim while Matthew handled the detail work around the doors below. The sun was slanting low through the oak trees, casting everything in that golden light that makes even ordinary moments feel significant. I was reaching for a spot just above the door frame, stretching to get the brush into a corner where the trim met the roof line, when the ladder shifted beneath me. It wasn't dramatic, just a slight slip on the grass, barely noticeable under normal circumstances. But I was overextended, off balance, and what should have been a minor adjustment became something more serious. I felt the ladder sliding sideways and threw my weight in the opposite direction, trying to compensate, but it was too late. The ground was coming up fast, and I had just enough time to think about how much this was going to hurt when strong hands caught me around the waist, steadying me, pulling me back from the fall. Matthew. His arms around me, solid and sure, holding me against his chest while my heart hammered against my ribs. The ladder clattered to the ground beside us, but I barely heard it over the sound of our breathing, harsh and quick in the still air. "I've got you," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been fear or relief or both. "I've got you." I was pressed against him, chest to chest, close enough to feel his heartbeat through his shirt, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. His arms were still around my waist, holding me steady, holding me safe. And for a moment, the careful distance we'd been maintaining collapsed entirely. "Thank you," I managed, though my voice came out barely above a whisper. Are you hurt? His hands moved over my back, checking for injuries with a thoroughness that felt both professional and intensely personal. Did you hit anything? No, I'm okay. You caught me. Yeah. His hands stilled on my back, and when I looked up, I found him watching me with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. I caught you. We stood there in the golden afternoon light, pressed together in a way that had nothing to do with accident and everything to do with choice. His hands were warm on my back, and I could feel the rise and fall of his chest. Could smell sawdust and sweat and something that was just him. Just Matthew. Time slowed, or maybe stopped entirely. The world narrowed to the space between us, to the way he was looking at me like he was trying to memorize something he might not see again. I could feel the weight of the summer in that look, all the careful moments and meaningful glances and things we'd never quite said out loud. Danny, he said, and my name sounded different in his voice now, rougher, more urgent. Yeah, I... He stopped, swallowed hard, tried again. I'm glad you're okay. It wasn't what he'd started to say. We both knew that. But it was what he could say, what was safe to say. And I understood the careful editing that had happened in the space between thought and speech. Me too, I said. His hands dropped from my back and he stepped away, putting distance between us that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. The moment shattered like glass, leaving us standing in the wreckage of something that had almost been. We should pick up the ladder, he said, his voice carefully neutral again. Yeah, of course. But neither of us moved immediately. We stood there looking at each other in the fading light, both of us breathing a little too hard, both of us trying to pretend that what had just happened was only about a near fall and a timely rescue. When we finally did pick up the ladder, when we gathered our tools and covered the paint and went through the familiar routine of ending another day, the air between us felt different, charged, like something had been acknowledged even if it hadn't been spoken aloud. That night, I lay in my childhood bed and thought about the weight of his hands on my back, the way he'd looked at me in that moment when time stopped, the careful way he'd said my name like it was something precious he was afraid to break. 3 more days, maybe 4. That's all we had left before the job was finished, before I'd have to make decisions about what came next. I was running out of time to figure out what I wanted those decisions to be. The last day of painting came sooner than I'd expected. We'd been working with the focused intensity of people who knew they were running out of time, putting in longer hours, taking shorter breaks, pushing to get every detail perfect before the deadline we'd both been trying not to think about. It was a Friday morning in mid-August, and the church stood before us, transformed. What had been weathered and tired 3 months ago now gleamed white in the morning sun, its clean lines and fresh paint making it look like something that belonged in a magazine, rather than a small town that had seen better days. We stood side by side in the parking lot, looking up at what we'd accomplished together. The work was good, better than good, professional. The kind of job that would last for years, that would weather storms and seasons and still look as fresh as it did right now. Well, Matthew said finally, his voice quiet, that's it. That's it. But neither of us moved. We stood there in the morning light, paint-stained and tired, and oddly reluctant to acknowledge that we were finished. Around us, the tools of our trade lay scattered, brushes and rollers and empty paint cans, the ladder leaning against Matthew's truck, the drop cloths we'd spread to protect the grass. It looks good, I said. Yeah, it does. He glanced over at me, and there was something in his expression that I couldn't quite read. We did good work. We did. A car drove past on Elm Street, slowing as it passed the church. Mrs. Davidson from the grocery store, probably heading to work. She waved from behind the wheel, and we both waved back automatically, playing our parts in the small-town theater that had been the backdrop for our summer. I should start loading the truck, Matthew said, but he didn't move toward the tools. I should help. You don't have to. You've done enough. The words stung more than they should have, carrying an undertone of finality that made my chest tighten. I want to help. He looked at me then, really looked at me. And I saw something in his brown eyes that might have been regret or gratitude or both. Okay. We worked together to load his truck, moving through the familiar routine of cleaning brushes and securing tools and making sure nothing was left behind. The rhythm we'd developed over the summer carried us through the process. But there was a weight to it now, a sense of ceremony that made every action feel significant. When the last tool was loaded and the final paint can secured, we stood beside his truck and looked back at the church one more time. It stood clean and bright in the morning sun, a testament to 3 months of careful work and careful conversation, and all the things we'd learned about each other without ever quite saying them out loud. "Thank you," Matthew said, his voice soft, "for the help, for—" He trailed off, shaking his head slightly. "Just thank you. Thank you for teaching me what to do, for the coffee every morning, for catching me when I fell." Something flickered in his expression at that last part, a recognition of all the ways that phrase could be interpreted. "Any time," he said, and the word carried the same weight it had carried weeks ago, loaded with promises neither of us knew how to keep. "I should go," I said, though I made no move toward my car. "My parents are expecting me for lunch." "Of course." He opened the door of his truck, then paused, with one hand on the frame. "Danny?" "Yeah?" "It was a good summer." "Yeah," I said, my throat tight with things I couldn't say. "It was." He climbed into the truck and started the engine, but he didn't drive away immediately. Instead, he sat there looking at me through the open window, his expression serious and searching, like he was trying to memorize something he might not see again. Finally, he put the truck in gear. "See you around." "See you around?" I watched him drive away, his truck disappearing around the corner onto Main Street, taking with it the last remnants of our shared routine. Only when the sound of his engine had faded completely did I turn and walk to my own car, my steps echoing in the empty parking lot. That evening, Matthew found me sitting on the back steps of the church, watching the sun set through the oak trees. I'd come back after dinner, drawn by something I couldn't name, some need to say goodbye to the place that had contained our summer. "Thought I might find you here," he said, settling beside me on the weathered wooden steps. "Couldn't stay away." "Me either." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from gold to orange to deep purple. Somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking, and there was the sound of children playing in someone's backyard, their voices carrying on the still air. "Strange to be finished," Matthew said after a while. "Yeah, strange. You're leaving tomorrow?" The question had been hanging between us all day, unspoken but present in every interaction. "Yeah, early morning." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Back to Portland. Back to Portland. Back to your real life." There was something in his tone that made me look over at him, some careful neutrality that suggested we were approaching deeper water again. This felt pretty real to me. Did it? He turned to face me, and in the fading light, his expression was serious and searching. Because sometimes I wondered if I was imagining things. The whole summer, I kept thinking maybe I was seeing what I wanted to see instead of what was actually there. "You weren't imagining it." The words came out quieter than I'd intended, but they carried the weight of 3 months of careful glances and meaningful silences, of moments when the space between us had felt charged with possibility. "Good," he said, and there was relief in his voice, and something that might have been hope. "I'm glad." We fell quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now, weighted with acknowledgement of things we'd been dancing around all summer. The air was cooling as the sun disappeared behind the trees, and somewhere in the church a board creaked as the building settled for the night. "You didn't say much this summer," Matthew said eventually, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "Neither did you." "No." A pause, long and considering. "Sometimes silence says enough." The truth of that settled between us like a benediction. We'd said more to each other in glances and gestures than some people said in years of conversation. We'd learned each other's rhythms, preferences, the subtle signs of mood and thought and feeling. We'd built something together that was more than just a fresh coat of paint on an old building. "What happens now?" I asked. "I don't know." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "What do you want to happen?" It was a dangerous question, one that opened doors I wasn't sure I was ready to walk through. But sitting there on the church steps in the gathering darkness, with the weight of the summer between us and the knowledge that I'd be gone in the morning, it felt like the only question that mattered. "I want to stay," I said, the words coming out in a rush before I could stop them. "I want to wake up tomorrow and have somewhere to go, something to do with you. I want more mornings with coffee that tastes like you remembered how I like it. I want more afternoons working beside you in the heat. I stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was admitting, both to him and to myself. "But," he prompted gently, "but I don't know how." I don't know what that would look like, or if it's even possible, or if you'd want that too. I looked over at him, trying to read his expression in the dim light. Would you want that? Danny. The way he said my name was answer enough, but he continued anyway. I've wanted that since the first morning when you showed up with paint in your hair and uncertainty in your eyes. I've wanted it every day for 3 months, and I'll probably want it every day after you leave. Then why didn't you say something? Because wanting something and being able to have it are different things. He picked up a piece of gravel from the step, rolled it between his fingers. Because you have a life in Portland that doesn't include small town contractors with more questions than answers. Because I was afraid that if I said something, you'd leave earlier than you had to. And now? Now you're leaving anyway, so I guess it doesn't matter what I say. The resignation in his voice broke something in my chest. It matters. It all matters. Does it? He looked over at me, and there was pain in his expression, carefully controlled but unmistakable. Because at the end of the day, you're still getting in your car tomorrow morning and driving back to your real life. And I'm still going to be here, working on other people's houses and trying to figure out what comes next. Maybe it doesn't have to be that simple, doesn't it? He stood up, brushing dust from his jeans. You're not going to give up your job and move back here to date a guy who's still figuring out who he is. And I'm not going to ask you to. Matthew, it's okay, Danny, really. He looked down at me, and in the last light of evening, I could see the careful way he was holding himself together. It was a good summer. Maybe that's enough. He started to walk away, heading toward the parking lot where his truck waited. I sat on the church steps and watched him go, paralyzed by the weight of everything we'd said and everything we hadn't said, everything we wanted and everything we couldn't have. Matthew, I called when he was halfway to his truck. He stopped, turned back to face me. It was more than a good summer, I said. For me, it was more than that. Something in his face softened, and for a moment I thought he might come back, might sit beside me again and figure out some way to make this work. But then he nodded, just once, and continued walking. I know, he said without turning around. For me, too. I sat on the church steps until full darkness fell, until the air grew cool and the first stars appeared overhead. When I finally stood to leave, my legs were stiff from sitting still for so long, and there was an ache in my chest that felt like grief for something that had never quite been mine to lose. The drive home took 5 minutes, but it felt like crossing a continent. I spent my last night in town packing the few belongings I'd brought with me, folding clothes that still smelled faintly of paint and summer heat. My mother hovered in the doorway, offering snacks and asking questions about my drive back to Portland, clearly struggling with her own version of goodbye. You'll call when you get there? She asked for the third time. Of course. And you'll come back for Christmas? I'll try. Try hard, she said. And there was something in her voice that suggested she knew more about my summer than I'd told her. It was good to have you home, Danny. Really good. It was good to be here. She kissed my forehead the way she had when I was small, and I let myself lean into the gesture, storing it up against the loneliness I knew was waiting for me back in Portland. I went to bed early, but slept poorly, waking every few hours to stare at the ceiling and think about the morning ahead. About the drive that would take me away from this place, away from the church that Matthew and I had transformed together, away from the possibility of something I'd never quite allowed myself to name. At 6 a.m., I loaded my car and said goodbye to my parents, accepting a thermos of coffee and a bag of sandwiches for the road. My father shook my hand with the formal gravity he reserved for important occasions, and my mother cried a little, though she tried to hide it. Drive safe, she said, and remember, this is home. It's always home. I'll remember. I drove through town slowly, taking one last look at the places that had shaped my childhood. The high school where I'd learned to be invisible, the library where I'd hidden during lunch periods, the park where I'd spent countless afternoons reading under the oak trees, dreaming of somewhere else. And then at the end of Elm Street, the church. St. Catherine's stood bright and clean in the morning sun, its fresh paint gleaming white against the green of the oak trees. It looked perfect, like something from a postcard. And for a moment, I felt a surge of pride in what we'd accomplished. I slowed the car as I passed, allowing myself one last look at the place where I'd spent my summer learning things about myself I hadn't known I needed to learn. About the satisfaction of honest work. About the weight of unspoken words. About the way it felt to want something you couldn't have and somehow be grateful for the wanting itself. There was no sign of Matthew's truck in the parking lot. No indication that anyone else was thinking about the summer that had just ended. Just the church, perfect and white, and somehow lonely in the morning light. I drove to the edge of town and stopped at the gas station where I'd bought candy as a child, where teenagers still gathered on Friday nights to plan their escapes. I filled my tank and bought coffee I didn't need, delaying the moment when I'd have to get back on the road and admit that this part of my life was over. While I was standing beside my car, checking my phone for messages I knew wouldn't be there, it buzzed in my hand. One new text, from a number I recognized, but had never saved in my contacts. If you ever come back, I still have that brush. Hmm. I stared at the screen for a long moment, reading the message over and over, trying to parse the layers of meaning in those 12 words. An invitation, a promise, a door left open, just barely, against the possibility of someday. I thought about typing a response, crafting something that would match his careful balance of hope and resignation. But in the end, I just smiled, small and tired but real, and put the phone away without replying. Some things were better left to silence, to the weight of unspoken understanding that had carried us through the summer. Some things were too fragile for words. I got in my car and merged onto the highway, heading north toward Portland and the life I'd built there. In my rearview mirror, the town grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, leaving nothing but road and sky, and the memory of golden mornings spent painting a church with someone who'd taught me that home could be a person as much as a place. The drive back to Portland took 6 hours, and I spent most of them thinking about brushes and coffee and the way Matthew Reeves said my name like it mattered. About the summer I'd spent trying not to notice him and how completely I'd failed. About the text in my phone that felt like a lifeline thrown across the distance between what was and what might someday be. I kept driving north toward the life that was waiting for me, carrying the weight of the summer like a secret I'd learned to keep. But for the first time in years, I wasn't running away from something. I was just going home to think about it. Fade to black. Key.